saying they don't deserve an ass kicking. I'm just saying that I can believe that this probably wasn't well thought through. They were probably a little intoxicated from the Venezuela experience.
I don't mean to put too fine a term on it, but it's a massive fuck up, isn't it, Mike?
There's been like incredible levels of support for the war from Trump's base.
Yes. Yeah.
Is that going to last if this drags on?
No, that support, even from the base, is not going to last if people start to think this thing's dragging on into the early summer.
One of the issues that we haven't addressed is terrorism and global terrorism. And there's a very real threat now that Iran is going to launch a global wave of terror.
My bigger concern is all the individuals out there, the lone wolf, who get triggered by this.
Mike Baker, welcome back to Trigonometry.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Great to have you. An interesting time to have you, obviously.
It seems that way.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah, there is a lot going on.
Before we get into what's gonna happen, what is your analysis of how we got here?
Well, we got here because for almost 50 years, right, the Iranian regime has kind of stuck to their guns, right? They've been remarkably consistent, right, over that time. To be fair, they've only had 2 supreme leaders. Now, maybe they've got a third. We don't know because no one's seen the new leader, Mojtaba. But after roughly 50 years of creating instability in the Middle East and refusing to negotiate in good faith about their nuclear program, continuing to ramp up their missile program, and then, finally slaughtering yet again, but this time in more numbers, thousands of their own citizens during the last round of demonstrations. I think that was kind of it. That was the thing that put them over the top, along with the fact that they just refused to budge off their negotiating tactic, which was, we're not talking about anything other than a small element of their nuclear program.
Were they not willing to, I don't know what the technical term is, but basically to merge their uranium so that it was at a low enrichment level? Did they not say
They talked about, and this is where it becomes difficult, right? Because, there's this perception that intelligence is like the movies or the beach books, right? It's all this or it's all that, right? The reality is with Iran, it's been a very heavy lift over all these years to understand with clarity.
Because what seemed like a normal conversation quickly turned into something much more intense. And according to viewers reacting online, the shift didn't feel accidentally, felt inevitable. Like the tension had already been there, waiting for the right moment to surface. It began with a statement that sounded confident, almost rehearsed. One of the speakers leaned forward, speaking clearly, laying out their point as if it was something obvious, something that didn't even need to be debated. The tone wasn't aggressive, but it carried that quiet certainty that usually goes unchallenged. For a moment, it did no interruptions, no pushback, just silence. But then came the response. Not loud, not emotional, just sharp. That's not what people are actually seeing. And just like that, everything shifted. You could feel it immediately. The energy in the room tightened. The expressions changed. The comfort that had been there seconds ago started to disappear. The first speaker paused just briefly, as if recalculating. But instead of stepping back, they leaned in further, repeating their point with more emphasis this time. Adding more detail, more certainty, trying to reinforce control over the narrative. But the response came again, calm, direct. You're describing what should be happening, not what is happening. That line landed hard, and viewers noticed. Fans are shocked, many later wrote. Because it didn't feel like a disagreement anymore, it felt like a challenge, not just to the argument, but to the confidence behind it. Another participant tried to step in, attempting to soften the exchange, suggesting that maybe both sides were interpreting things differently. His tone carried a sense of urgency, like he was trying to prevent things from escalating further. But it didn't work, because the reply didn't ease anything, it sharpened it. Different interpretations don't mean equal accuracy. And that's when the tension really started to build. You could see it in the way people shifted in their seats, in the way responses became shorter, tighter, more defensive. The rhythm of the conversation changed completely. The first speaker tried again. this time slowing down, choosing words more carefully, as if trying to regain control, not through force, but through precision. "You're missing the broader context," they said, and the response came instantly. "Then explain it clearly. Simple, direct, and impossible to dodge." There was a pause, long enough to feel uncomfortable. Viewers pointed this moment out again and again, saying this was where everything flipped. The person who started with confidence now seemed uncertain, while the other side looked completely steady. But instead of backing down, the first speaker pushed harder. People are reacting emotionally. They said, their tone now carrying frustration. That's the problem. And for a second, it felt like that might land. But the response came softer and somehow stronger. Or maybe the voice said, people are reacting to something real. So that line spread fast.
What is going on there within their programs, particularly their missile and their nuclear programs? What they were talking about was taking that 60% enriched uranium, and there is no peaceful civilian purpose for 60% enriched uranium. There just isn't, right? And so they were talking about, well, we could reduce that down to 20%. The problem is with the enrichment process, getting to 60%, getting to 20% even, you've done most of the heavy lift. Moving it on to 90% or thereabouts, where it's considered weapons grade, that's the speediest part. So 5%, 4%, if there was intelligence that said all these years that's all they had because they keep claiming that they've had a civilian peaceful purpose for this, then I think things would have been different at this point. But people talk about, well, my God, the Trump administration, they started this conflict during the middle of negotiations. Reality was, it was negotiations in name only. There was no real serious effort, much like they've done in the past. They were just looking to buy time.
And the question is now whether regime change was ever realistic or going to happen, right? What's your assessment of this? Because we had a bunch of people over the course of the last week on the show, and some of the arguments that have been put forward is like, regime change isn't going to work and never was going to work, and therefore this is a big mistake.
Well, toppling any regime, by air operations only that's a low percentage shot, right? So you can, lots of things can be true at the same time. Like, personally, I can think that it's about time that this regime leaves the planet, right, and gives the people of Iran a better future. Some form of government that could do that. I can believe that you're never going to get long-term peace and stability in the Middle East as long as this particular regime exists, right? Because their stated objective constantly has been one thing: the destruction of Israel. They built their proxy network for that purpose. Proxies all have the same objective. And frankly, most of the regional actors, we're starting to see that now, would much rather see this regime go.
Okay.
Right? I can believe all of that, right? At the same time, I can believe that this probably wasn't well thought through.
Right.
Right. And that if you've watched this, I had a good friend who was one of the hostages during when the takeover, when the Shah fell. If you've watched this regime for all these years, it's not hard to understand where they are now, right? You watched them over the years build a system, right, between the clerical authority, the political authority, however you want to refer to it, and the military and the IRGC, that was very robust, could withstand something like this over the years, right? So you've got a commander in the IRGC. Well, now they've got 3 others in line who they know will take that person's place if something happens to him, right? This is how they've developed this over the years. So I'm just, I think that perhaps, I'm not saying they don't deserve an ass kicking. I'm just saying that I think there were people who thought this was going to be easier than it was, and that's surprising. I think there were people who didn't see that the Strait of Hormuz would become the thing, right? It's the only leverage point they've really got, right? And so to think that somehow Strait of Hormuz wouldn't become, closed in a sense, not officially closed, but it's closed for all intents and purposes. That to me would be I'd like to think everyone's thought this through, I guess is what I'm saying. It doesn't appear that way, because there still seem to be some people in Washington surprised that, oh my God, what do you mean we've shut down the flow of 20% of the world's oil, LNG, along with everything else that goes through the strait. So that's what I mean by I'm not sure that this was completely well thought through.
And how is that possible? You're ex-CIA. I mean, the United States has the biggest intelligence operation in the world, the biggest military in the world, the most military planners in the world.
You sound like the U.S. president. We've got the biggest military.
You do. You do. And therefore this is the bit that doesn't sound like the president of the United States. It's extraordinary that we might be sitting here weeks into a conflict going, I can't believe they didn't think it through. How does that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's probably a lot of people trying to think about that. But look, if the Pentagon has a lot of smart people and a lot of mid and senior level people who came up through the Afghan experience, right? Combat operations, Afghanistan and Iraq, real world experience, right? Now, does that mean that they are listened to? I don't know, I'm not sitting in the room. I'm just saying that I can't imagine that there weren't briefings where someone pointed to a big map of the Strait of Hormuz and said, it's about 21 miles wide, but it's actually much narrower because of the depths and because of the corridors for the shipping lanes. Here's what they've done in the past. They've closed it before. They've threatened to close it constantly. We all knew that. How are we going to prevent that from happening? But now we're in a position where we're saying, well, geez, we'd sure like China to come in with and help, or we're asking other countries to come in and help. That seems to be an indication that perhaps there was some surprise. And maybe it was because they thought the regime was going to collapse. Once we had very good intelligence about that initial strike on some of the leadership, including the supreme leader. And maybe there was this feeling, because people always think they can do it better, right? Every generation thinks they can do something better. Maybe that was part of it. And they thought that we'll get regime change. They were probably a little intoxicated from the Venezuela experience. So,
I mean, I don't mean to put too fine a term on it, but it's a massive up, isn't it? Like,
well, it depends on how you define up. It depends on what the word is, as Bill Clinton said. But who, by the way, I think is a very smart individual.
Fast. Clips of it started circulating, people replaying it, debating it, breaking it down from every angle. Some praised it, others criticized it. But almost everyone agreed that moment changed everything. Inside the conversation, the structure had completely broken down. No one was sticking to a safe, predictable path anymore. It had become raw, unpredictable, and impossible to fully control. One of the participants tried to shift the focus again, saying that discussions like this only create more confusion, more division. His tone suggested frustration, but also a hint of uncertainty. The response didn't match that energy. It slowed things down again. Confusion doesn't come from discussion, the voice said. It comes from avoiding it. And that line hit in a different way, not sharp, not confrontational, but heavy. Because it didn't just respond, it exposed something deeper. You could see it in the reactions. A slight shake of the head, a glance away. A pause that lasted just a little too long. The confidence that had been there at the beginning, it was gone, replaced by something else. Pressure. And as the conversation continued, moving further into uncomfortable territory, one thing became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a moment where control was slipping, and no one in the room seemed fully prepared for what that meant. And just when it felt like the tension had reached its peak, it didn't explode, tightened, pulling everyone deeper into a conversation that was no longer easy to navigate. The shift was subtle but undeniable, and according to viewers reacting online, this was the point where the discussion stopped being about winning an argument and started becoming about holding ground. One of the panelists leaned forward again, slower this time, his tone more controlled, almost cautious. He said that the conversation was being framed in a way that made it seem like one perspective carried more weight than the other. And that kind of imbalance only creates more confusion for people trying to understand the issue. For a moment, it sounded like a reasonable attempt to stabilize things. But the response came without hesitation. Or maybe, the voice said calmly, it only feels unbalanced because the usual narrative isn't holding up. That line didn't just challenge the point, it shifted the focus entirely. You could see it in the reactions. A slight pause, a tightening of expressions. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but loaded. The panelists tried to respond quickly, saying that narratives exist for a reason, that they are built on information, on patterns, on what has been observed over time. But again, the reply came steady, and they can also be questioned. Simple, direct, and difficult to push back against. The tension didn't spike, it deepened. Another voice stepped in, this time more assertive, saying that constantly questioning everything creates instability. That people need clarity, not endless debate. But the answer didn't match the urgency. It slowed things down again. Clarity doesn't come from avoiding questions, the voice replied. It comes from answering them honestly. And that line hit in a different way, because it didn't just address the argument, it exposed the hesitation behind it. One of the panelists shifted in his seat, exhaling slowly, clearly feeling the pressure of the moment. He said that not every question has a clear answer. And pushing for one can sometimes create more confusion than understanding. For a brief second, it seemed like that might redirect the conversation. But the response came measured as ever. Then say that the voice said, "Don't replace uncertainty with certainty just to feel in control." That line lingered, longer than most, because it struck at something deeper, the need to appear certain. Even when things aren't. Viewers later pointed this moment out repeatedly, saying it was one of the most revealing parts of the entire exchange. Fans are shocked, many wrote, because it felt less like a debate and more like watching someone peel back layers that usually stay hidden. The panelists didn't respond immediately, and that silence once again became part of the story. Another participant tried to shift the direction, saying that the real issue wasn't about control or narratives, but about responsibility, about how conversations like this impact people watching from the outside. His tone was more careful now, less confrontational, as if he was trying to find a point that everyone could agree on. But the reply came steady as ever. Responsibility includes being honest about complexity, the voice said. And just like that, the tension returned. Because now the conversation wasn't just about what was being said, was about how it was being said. And why? One of the panelists shook his head slightly, frustration starting to show again. This is exactly what confuses people, he said. They don't need more complexity, they need clear answers. The response came softer this time, but somehow even more impactful. Clear answers aren't always the same as true answers. That line spread fast. Viewers replayed it, clipped it, debated it. Some called it powerful. Others said it made things more complicated. But almost everyone agreed. It shifted the entire tone of the discussion again. Inside the room, you could feel the weight of it. The conversation had slowed down even more now. Every response was deliberate. Every pause carried meaning. No one was rushing anymore, because rushing meant losing control, and that control was already slipping. One of the panelists leaned back, running his hand across his face, as if trying to reset his thoughts. "This is going in circles," he said quietly. But even that didn't sound convincing, because it wasn't a circle. It was movement. Just not the kind anyone expected. Another voice finally broke in, this time less defensive, more reflective. He said that maybe the real issue wasn't about who was right or wrong, but about how these conversations are framed in the first place. How certain ideas are elevated while others are dismissed. That shifted something. Even the others seemed to pause. Abby nodded slightly, acknowledging the point, and for a moment, felt like the conversation might finally settle into something calmer. But then she added, and why some perspectives only become acceptable after they gain enough attention. And just like that, the tension returned, but in a different form. Quieter, deeper, because now it wasn't about disagreement, it was about recognition, and that's harder to argue against. The room fell into another silence. Not uncomfortable this time, but heavy, reflective. The kind of silence where everyone knows something important has just been said, even if they don't fully agree with it. Viewers later described this part as the most intense, not because of raised voices or dram, because of raised voices or dram.